Hello and welcome to Office of Harvey in December. It is the end of the third year of making these book reviews. It has been almost, I don't know if I've surpassed 200 reviews of books, but there has been a lot of books and it has been a really fun experience. I have read so much more than I ever thought I would in my life. I have collected all these thoughts that I'm really grateful that I get to go back and look upon. So in the future, if I ever forget something that I've read, then I can just look at a video and see what a version of myself in the past thought about a book. So I do think that I'm going to continue this next year. I've got my own categories planned out, and I am quite glad to be finishing categories for this year. I'm getting a little bit tired of them, but it's the last time I'm going to do this. Yeah, no clap this time. I can't really get to work. But these are the last 5 books of the year. I had a really good reading month, actually. I felt like these are very diverse, lots to think about. I was frequently reflecting on my reading as I was going through the month, which is more than I can say for many of my reading months so far. I think I've finally hit the stage where I'm picking out books that I enjoy out of my shelf rather than books that I'm reading out of obligation. So it's been good. Book number 1 is Close Range by Annie Proulx. This is a book of short stories set in Wyoming, and it features estates that I personally am not super familiar with. So one of my side reading challenges is to try and read a book or a story set in every US state, and right now I'm sitting at about 20%. I feel like I've read more books set in New York than I have in I've read more than 50 books set in New York compared to all the other states that I just haven't even visited. And Wyoming is a state that I really didn't know very much about going into this book, so I had this assumption based on the blurb and the covers that it would be a book about cowboys and a book about life on the range. I don't know why my brain associates that with southern United States lifestyles like Texas, but Wyoming is a central northern state, and so they have a harsh winter climate and they have quite a dry climate, which makes its way into a lot of these stories. It creates conflicts because it is such a sparsely populated state that we have individuals and families moving there to try and create industry and to try and make a name for themselves, but they're forced into these really fraught relationships where they are at odds with their natural environments and they need to rely on the people near them, but the people near them are geographically very far away and also emotionally very different and also kind of awful. So this is a really brutal set of stories about characters who are in Wyoming trying to make a name for themselves and being forced into connections or relationships or neighborly situations that are just not good for them, but because of the geography and the economics of the climate, there's not really anything else they can do. They're just kind of stuck in this situation and bad things happen, unexpected violent situations happen. It reminds me quite a bit of Alice Munro writing about Canada, and although the circumstances are different, the writing style to me is very similar. And I have read Annie Proulx before. I've read The Shipping News, and The Shipping News being set in, I can't remember if it was Canada or Alaska, but a very far northern area of that continent. It also had that relationship between the personal, the relational, and the hostile natural environment. And it's a theme that I think is worthwhile and very literary, but also, to me, not exceptionally engaging. To me, these feel like stories that are just literary and a strong demonstration of the writer's skill. They create an emotional response through the natural environment, through the interpersonal relationship with the characters. No one is particularly likable, but it is just that. It is just a book that you kind of appreciate skill. And Annie Proulx's writing is really quite wonderful. The way that she creates sentences and does descriptions is very vivid and evocative. The Shipping News I knew for this dramatic sparseness in its description, whereas Close Range is a bit more reasonable. Like, I don't feel like when I'm reading it, it is a really striking writing style. It's instead just a very descriptive style that is often easy to follow. It's not always the easiest to follow. It is sometimes dressed up in a way that needs interpretation, and there are sometimes very strange moments of magic realism or metaphor that I can't really tell if it's meant to be taken seriously or not, but overall, not too difficult to read. I will say, though, that this collection is best known for the final story, Brokeback Mountain, which was adapted into the famous Ang Lee film that didn't win Best Picture that one year. Everyone's has opinions about it, and I feel like I should have opinions too. The blurb actually only mentions Brokeback Mountain, so this is a collection of short stories where every single pull quote at the back is just referring to the final story. And as I was reading this collection, I read my short story collections out of order, but as I was reading the ones before reading Brokeback Mountain, I knew of the gravitational pull that this last story was going to have, and the last story is really, really good. So compared to the other texts in this book, Brokeback Mountain is by and large the best one. It is much more emotional, much clearer in its intention. It follows two rangers or cowboys who find work in Wyoming and develop a romantic and sexual relationship, which is seen as very taboo by the people in the environment. But because it is so remote and arid, they end up drawing closer to one another, both physically and emotionally. And then as they go back and try to resume the very railroaded life that people in Wyoming in this book seem to lead, that leads that whole start a family and have children and make your own business kind of thing, these two main characters, their relationship strains against the normalizing forces of their context, and it becomes just a very emotionally powerful story. There are so many different elements pulling these characters in different ways, and the fact that they are so human and so fallible and also just not very good at expressing their emotions. It's not just a story about relationships, it's also a story about masculinity. It's just done quite well, and I think that it makes sense why this was the one that was adapted into the film. It makes sense why the film was so tremendously successful. It's just a good story. I feel so mean saying this. I would recommend reading Brokeback Mountain and probably not the rest of this book. I think some of these stories do blend together. There are a few that I do like, but it really is Brokeback Mountain and some other works. I give it a 3 out of 5, and Brokeback Mountain gets a 4 out of 5. Book number 2, so you'll see that the books I chose this month are either very long or very, very short. Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au is a Australian novel about a mother and daughter going to Japan. It is recently prescribed on the New South Wales HSC text list that is due to come into effect in 2017, I want to say, and 2027. Oh, what? That's so far in the future. Is due to come into effect in 2027. And so there are only really 3 novels set for study in that common core text and human experiences. There's this one, there's An Imaginary Life by David Malouf, and there is Henry Lawson short stories. I do want to make a video soon about all the texts that have been prescribed and just my views on each of them. I'm trying to read through as many of them as I can in this Christmas break, so this video will mark the end of my reviews for 2024, and then next year, or this period towards the end of the year to start next year, I will just try and read as much as I can. A lot of the novels prescribed are very short. This one is also very short. It's only about 90-something pages, and it is very self-enclosed. It is a bit non-linear, so it goes into the backstory of these 2 characters, but it really is just 2 main characters on holiday in Japan. And I picked this as a make me cry because I've read some reviews about how emotionally powerful it is, and it really is. It is a book that has successfully made me cry. I think the only one this year, possibly, but I did very definitely have a moment in the office after finishing this on the train. Oh goodness, I had a real emotional time. And the powerful thing about this book is that nothing really happens. Like, it's not a book about sad situations, it's just about this holiday, and just the conversational visual details of the holiday belie so much truth about this familial relationship that it just hit all the right notes for me. It is just a wonderfully written, very powerful book. 5 out of 5. Incredibly well done, well written, so detailed in how it puts everything together. It's just fantastic. And I will have a lot more to say about this book when I talk about it in terms of the prescriptions, because to briefly summarize my thoughts on that front, I don't think that teenagers will find this book particularly engaging. I think it will not be a good option to study at school. I think I really needed the additional 10 plus years of life experience after graduating high school in order to appreciate this book, to actually see the world from both my parents' eyes and my own, is something that is required to get the effect here. I think that if some of this book goes over the reader's head, it is very boring because it is just a holiday. There is no overt story here. It is entirely undercurrent, and that's what makes it really remarkable for me. And in the same sense, I see that this book has gotten some mixed reviews internationally, and I see entirely why that is the case. But I'm personally very excited for this. I think it is such a landmark moment in Australian literary fiction, where I want to compare this to Rachel Cusk, in the sense that it's very archetypally about relationships, yet using this sparse narration and using this very ordinary moment. But I like it more than Rachel Cusk. I like it more than this literary author that is internationally renowned for this style. I think this book is doing it better. So it's genuinely fantastic. Please do grab a copy, read it. It's so short, it takes an afternoon to get through. Very curious to hear more thoughts and read more reviews about what this book is doing for other people. All I can say that is, for myself, it is an incredible read, one of the best reads I've had all year. It's so hard to talk about because it's just, nothing happens, but it's just, every part of it is done so well. It's just fantastic. It's just really, really excellent. Book number 3, I'm going in the order that I finished them. This is A Prayer for Owen, Meany. In contrast to Cordon Off for Snow, this is a doorstopper. I know this edition doesn't look very big, but this copy is 617 pages, and gosh, is this a weird book. It is a beloved work of American literature, a bestseller, and a book set in New Hampshire, so I can tick that state off my list as well. It is about a narrator who grows up in this state, and he's just kind of an ordinary person, a little bit literary, but also not incredibly bright or smart. And his friend is named Owen Meany. Owen Meany is one of the most defined characters I've read all year. He is so well described, he's so detailed, and it's very Dickensian in its scope, because what Irving is doing in this book feels like what Charles Dickens likes to do in his books, which first of all is write a really, really long novel from birth to death, but also to make characters that feel just a little bit exaggerated, that it goes beyond the sense of realism, that you can kind of laugh at these characters who are just a little bit larger than life, and yet they are close enough to our reality that we can feel some emotional gravitas towards the things they go through. It's not satire, it's a kind of observational humor that bends reality to the will of the story. And so Owen Meany, incredibly defined character. He is very short and has a loud voice. Every single piece of text that he says or writes in this book is in caps. So sometimes when you flick through and you'll just get pages of just like entirely caps. It's very funny. And Owen is the son of stonemasons around, or like a quarry worker around New Hampshire, and so he's very skilled in working with stone. He believes in religious determinism. So this is something of a religious text. It builds a lot of theology into the work, but I'm also very interested in how it's not like a proselytizing text. It's not even a text that presents religious belief in a positive or a negative light. It's just kind of, it's there. It's very deeply ingrained into all these characters. But Owen Meany believes in perfect determinism, so that every single event of a person's life is predetermined and has a key purpose. And that is very difficult to reconcile with the history of this book at the time of its setting across the late 1960s through the Vietnam War. And this is a time where America especially was grappling with the fact that a lot of stuff seemed to happen and they couldn't really tell if it's right or wrong. So we had things like the Kennedy assassination, or just JFK's life in general and his moral standing. We have conflicts between Catholicism and Protestantism and various church denominations. We have the Billy Graham revival. We have the moon landing. We have the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is so structurally integral to the story. And we have a country that seems to be grappling with its identity and its role on the world stage in a not entirely positive way. It wasn't a fully optimistic time. It was a time where people were starting to develop really divisive attitudes towards politics. And so Owen Meany, in all of this, is trying to figure out what his visions for the future really mean if he has faith in this God that has created him and has created him for a certain purpose. And he uses the narrator in order to achieve some of these goals, because he himself just doesn't have he doesn't have the body for it, but he needs to go beyond his own personal capabilities. He needs to rely on other people in order to try and bring about things. And so this book is just filled with recurring symbols and motifs. It's really masterfully constructed, if I had to say it myself, is that eventually I'm going to say that I didn't like elements of this book, and I'm not going to give it an entirely positive review, but praising it first and foremost is that the symbols are just so well done. They are running all the way through the story, and there are events throughout the text that reinforce these symbols the entire way through. So the catalyst of the text is that there's a baseball game in the protagonist's youth, and Owen Meany is the last person to bat, and because he's so short, he usually doesn't swing at all. He's usually used as a pinch hitter so that he could just bunt the ball and everyone else wins. But this final game, where the team is so far ahead and everyone's winning, and it's just like a lazy afternoon, ordinary day, the coach just tells Owen to let it rip, just swing as hard as he can. And Owen does. He hits a foul ball, and it hits the protagonist's mother in the head, and she passes away. And this horrifying act of circumstance allows the protagonist and Owen Meany to have this bond where now Owen feels implicated in the life of the narrator because everything is for Owen is determined. And so there's lots of these different plot threads that run throughout the text. It's about trying to rediscover who the mother was, and also the narrator doesn't know who his father was, so they're trying to figure out together, him and Owen are trying to figure out who his father was. At the same time, we have all the events through American history. We have Owen, this is late in the text now, both the characters getting caught up in the Vietnam War draft and having to figure out what they'll do with the potential of having to go overseas and fight for their country, but also just the generic story of growing up through high school, taking responsibility for your actions, becoming the kind of person that you want to be, going off to study, taking a vocation, finding a partner, all of those things, is a big and wide-reaching text. And the fact that these symbols recur all through the text and give unity to these otherwise completely disparate forms of storytelling is tremendously impressive. I think the way that these symbols evolve as well means that the very last chapter is incredibly powerful when you're reading it in the moment, because it gives you these things that you already know what they mean, so that you can see where the story is going in the best possible way. So the things that you thought previously as you're reading it as being weirdly inconsequential, like, I don't understand why the author would spend so much time elaborating on just these tiny little details, by the end become critically relevant. They are a powerful agreement to Owen Meany's belief that everything is determined, and because this is a fictional book, it is determined, right? Everything is constructed in this certain way so that it is all relevant to the end. It all comes together, and to me, that's just the pinnacle of American storytelling, right? It's just so well designed and everything's there for its right place. It's just good. I feel like if you look at this book in terms of its just core merits and everything being where it needs to be, it's just masterfully done, really well done. And then you turn around and you look at it a second time. I think this is one of those books that is a bit worse on its second reading because it's bloated. It's got lots and lots of moments throughout the text that almost feel like they're stalling for time, or feel like they have to be there because we're telling the story of two young boys growing up. And a lot of it, especially towards the earlier parts, is a bit male gazy. The narrator has his sexual awakening with his cousin, and I don't know how much of that description was really necessary, and lots of other things. Like, a lot of the earlier chapters are built around performing a play, the nativity scene, and of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. There's scenes of the narrator trying to write an essay about Tess and the D'Urbervilles. There's a lot of diatribe about the power of literature all through the text, and classic literature especially, that I don't know how meaningful it is if you haven't read a bunch of classical works. And do I feel that it could have been shortened? Probably, but I also feel that this book is very much trying to champion the ethos of Victorian social realism storytelling, so Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy and all those authors, trying to bring that into the modern day of the 1980s in America and making it relevant for audiences, and it worked. It sold like hotcakes. It is a massively influential book, and It's good. It did pretty well. I would give it a, I want to say 3 out of 5, but I think it's actually a 4 out of 5. Of just how much I respect it and how much I think it was effective in readers' lives, I think it is a achievement. But I also think there's this shallow hollowness to it in terms of its construction. I think that everything is exactly where it is supposed to be because it's constructed as a narrative, and it doesn't draw attention to that fact. It's not really a book about storytelling. But it's not a realistic book. It's not a book that makes me think any of the themes are going to be particularly relevant to my life in some way, because I just, in the real world, don't view determinism in the same way that this book does. I think in that sense, it's almost like a fantasy text where everything becomes relevant in the best possible way for the enjoyment of the audience. And if you're reading books for enjoyment, then I would pick one that is paced more briskly. I just have all these kind of little complaints about different aspects of the text, and that holds it back from me absolutely loving it, because it's just long and bulky and messy, and although there are moments of absolute brilliance, and I know that there are people out there that say this is their favorite book, they read it every year, it's just incredible. I see that, I definitely do. I think there are some really wonderful things about this book. But I also think that I wouldn't have read this if it wasn't for the 100 Books reading challenge that I'm doing at the moment. And I also don't think that I will remember this book very much next year or in the coming years. I think it will be replaced by literary works that align better with my sensibilities and my perception of reality. But for what it's worth, for the 15 days of my life that this book took up, I did enjoy them. I did laugh too, so I put this in my Make Me Laugh category. I wasn't really sure what category to put it in when I started reading it. I thought it was going to be funny, I thought it was going to be sad. It is both those things, but it is primarily funny. And even the dramatic moments towards the end, there's an interpretation of them which is just hilarious. So I think it's well done. I did chuckle. It is very funny. It doesn't always land, of course, and it is rooted in social and cultural monikers of the 1980s, positives, negatives, but yeah, it's good. It's good. Book number 4, the last of the Neapolitan novels, The Story of the Lost Child. This series has been massively meaningful to me this year. It has been just a book that every time I read it, it emotionally affects the rest of my life. Like, I start to see my conversations and my relationships in a deeper sense, and I start to feel emotional responses for the characters even when I'm not reading it, because something about the way this book is written just makes these characters matter to me so much that it's otherworldly. Like, I can't explain it. And every time I try to analyze it, I come up with blanks, because it's not a particularly stylish book, and it feels deliberately so. It is absent of symbols and metaphors and figurative language. Often I'll be reading a few pages and think, oh, this is the first simile I've seen for like 3 pages, right? It is very literal, it is very first person. So following along from the Neapolitan novel story, each one is an episode in the life of the narrator, also named Elena, who is now she's a writer, but she grows up in a small village in Naples, and her best friend, whose name is, she calls her Lila, other characters call her Lena, her official, or like, government name, I think, is Raffaella, who's this magnetic figure. Everyone falls in love with her. Lila is just powerfully emotional and somewhat capricious, very powerful, just a really magnetic character. And our narrator is so much more unsure of herself because of her relationship to Lila. That is the core narrative across all these texts, and each one takes a snapshot of a different part of their life. The first book, My Brilliant Friend, is about growing up and going through school. Second book, Story of a New Name, is about Lila getting married and their marital life changing the way they relate to the narrator. Third book, Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, is about Elena, the narrator, leaving Naples to pursue literary work around Italy. And the last one, The Story of the Lost Child. So now we have both characters becoming mothers, and various circumstances have led them back to the original neighborhood they grew up. We have still this sense of twinning where similar things are happening to Elena and or Lila at the same time, and through that we get to see different dynamics of their relationship, but also different dynamics of humanity, how one person might react in one way and another one might react in another way. One of the core themes of this novel is the propagation of generational attitudes. I want to say trauma, but it's more than that. I think we see moments where Elena's mother, who in various ways is abusive, not a very good mother, causes a lot of emotional anguish for Elena. A lot of those characteristics are then passed down through Elena to her children, not in a deliberate way or even in a palpable way. Elena herself doesn't really call herself out on this very much, but it is very clear for the audience to see that there is an unescapable quality of these characters that arises from their upbringing and their family that they pass down to the next generation, and hinting at towards the end of the book, the next generation will continue to perpetuate that. And the struggles of the characters to try and break free from these patterns, or just even wonder if it's worthwhile to try and break free from these patterns, is so core to the full set of Neapolitan novels, and it is also such a wonderfully complex theme to try and tackle in a book like this. I've not seen really any other work that reflects this generational transmission of values as well as the series. I just think that the amount of detail given to each of the characters, and the fact that it is so blunt and straightforward as well in its writing style, means that it's focused on events, it's focused on moments and concrete images. It isn't distracting the reader with aesthetic beauty. In fact, I would call this a very blunt and brutal book. It's not elegant, or it is elegant, but it's not aesthetic, it's not beautiful, it's not trying to rouse up wonder or strong emotion. Instead, it's very everyday and plain, to the extent that when there is violence, the feeling is that it's not a explosion that is different from the norm. The violence is just kind of in the norm. The violence is one of the many ways of solving a problem, and it's one that many characters resort to because the way that violence has been used against them in the past. So it's harrowing. It's a tough read, and the novel, I don't know if it's spoiling this because it is the fourth book in the series. The novel gets its name from one of Leela's children disappearing, and I want to talk about this. So I give this spoiler because this core narrative moment of the child getting lost shows this novel functioning, and by and large the whole series, functioning on different levels. The lost child could mean a few different things. The lost child could either be a symbol of the violence of the neighborhood, and the fact that something so dear to the characters can just be taken away as an act of violence, and there are hints to what characters could have done it and why they could have done it. That's one dynamic, right? Is this really brutal story about bad things happening to characters because of harrowing socioeconomic circumstances. Story one. Story two is that the lost child is a way of showing these two mothers reacting to this, and it's a comparison point between Leela and Elena. It shows motherhood in the sense, and it shows one of the worst things that could happen to a mother, and it's played very straight as to how different people might emotionally react to the situation. And lastly, the lost child is more metaphorically, you can interpret it this way, about Elena and Leela abandoning their children for their own personal lives, and what that means in our modern climate. So now that women are not just seen as mothers and homemakers, both of them have complex relationship arrangements rather than a standard nuclear family. And so how do we look at these characters as mothers, and as, now that the child is lost, not mothers? That also works very strongly. So I don't know if I explained this very well, but to me that means this book functions on three levels. It functions as a realism story, it functions as a drama story, and it functions as a largely symbolic and allegorical story. And depending on which one you have taken so far in this series of 4 books, you might arrive at a different conclusion at the end. I didn't love the ending of this book because it leans, in my mind, more towards the realism side of things. It's a book that just shows things happening to characters, and that will be the logic to how this book ends. And I can understand the artistic intent of doing that, and I really respect Elena Ferrante for taking that route. Really, it's kind of the opposite problem I had with A Prayer for Owen and Meany. A Prayer for Owen and Meany feels very constructed as a book. It feels very made for a certain purpose to elicit a certain emotional reaction, and that construction is evident as I read it. Whereas The Story of Lost Child feels unconstructed. Like, it feels just like a camera on the wall, and all narrative arcs that happen in this book are incidentally there through the reader's interpretation of them. It isn't so much telling a story even, as much as it is just us watching these lives play out for a little bit. But aside from that, it is fantastic, and it is effective. It is one of the strongest feelings of transport that I've had all year. Just each of these texts, reading, makes me feel things that I otherwise wouldn't have, right? It makes me feel all these made-up emotions about made-up characters, and it is so, so powerful, and it understands people so, so well. So, from a skill perspective, the whole series, 4 books together, gets a 5 out of 5. But one by one, I think I love the second book the most. That was the one that gave a 5 out of 5. The first one I think is the best one for a standalone, and I would recommend the first book to just about anyone, mindful of content warnings, whereas 1, 3, and 4 to me are all 4 out of 5s. And for the reasons I've outlined so far, is that they're realistic books, and as effective as they are, as well crafted as they are, I just need to think about them more. I think maybe that's the case. Maybe I'll come back and reread these and all of them will turn out to be 5 out of 5s. I don't know. Last one for December, Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Very fitting, this is the Booker Prize winner of 2024. A tiny little novel where, very similar to Cold Enough for Snow, nothing happens. We have 6 characters on a space station orbiting the world. Very helpfully, we have a map of the journey that the space station takes at the front, which is very cool. And it is immaculately researched. It shows the nature of life on this space station, and it explores just a little bit into these characters' backstories that we're reminded that they're human, but also it is just such a massive zoom out to the nature of humanity when you are outside of the Earth looking at every other human being at one single time. You're watching storms go across the surface of the world that will have massive impacts for individuals, but you can't see those individuals. And so it drives the story to metaphor, to try and express this otherwise completely incomprehensible feeling that we have, and just to completely obliterate our sense of ego, because we're on this dot, and we can see that dot from the outside. I think it's interesting, and I think it's different to just about everything else I've read this year. It doesn't really have a plot. I would say that there's not really an arc to what's happening so far. There are events, and there are characters, and there are backstories, and there are all the things that would make a general novel, but it also sometimes feels like I'm reading nonfiction because of just the way that it's reflecting on the nature of humanity, the nature of space. It does make me want to go into space more, and I know at TikTok or a meme or whatever about how it's a red flag to want to go into space. I think this book sells the idea of space well, and I would love to do it if it wasn't at the expense of the planet. And I think this book kind of refers to that as well, is that we need to do something about our planet, and going into space is not a solution to that. It doesn't even change these characters that much. If anything, it just shows how difficult it is for one individual human being to do anything to fix our planets. But it makes the problems of our planets very at the forefront and very urgent. So it's a book that makes you love the world and love humanity. It's a book that is very philosophical about who we are and why we are the way we are, when ultimately we are not very much of anything at all. It is a book of massive, massive scope, and yet it is so tiny. I give it a 4 out of 5. I think it raises some interesting ideas, and depending on how engaged you are by very floral writing. So I know I've mentioned a lot of books this month that just don't have that sense of aesthetic beauty to them. This book is full of aesthetic beauty, and it is very measured on the author's part to try and make beautiful moments in everything they try to write about, and it works. I think I'm a sucker for aesthetic writing, and this book does successfully do it well. Really, it feels like a book that is a inhalation and an exhalation compared to all the rest of my reading life. It is just so different from everything else, and I don't think I'll read a book like this again in quite a while. It's an odd one for the Booker Prize, it really is. It doesn't fit into the stereotypes of Booker Prize winners at all. It's also one of the rare uses of true omniscient perspective. We get all these characters' thoughts, but we get them from an external narrator that has a voice and is not the author. We so rarely get this style of writing now, and it reminds me of those old Russian classics, of course, but it's a technique that is used for a very different purpose here. It's one that really puts us into this mind space of 6 astronauts that are together one organism because they breathe the same air and they inhabit the same moisture, and any sense of individuality kind of fades away to dust because of just how the quality of being in space and of being separate from the planet that you came from. It's interesting. It's a very reflective book. Oftentimes I would stop reading, just think about more things before I could return to it. And it's a good reading experience. I would recommend it, and of the Booker Prize winners I've read this year, it is one of the better ones, but I am giving it a 4 out of 5. Okay, thank you for joining. These are the 5 books of December for this year. I will probably not be making another video this year, even though I did promise, whatever it was, to finish reading the William Faulkner novels. I did finish reading The Sound of Fury, and I loved that book. I wanted to give it a 5 out of 5, but I want to review that book with Absalom, which I know for a fact I will not finish this year. It has defeated me once again. I will try again next year, but who knows how it's going to go. The Sound of Fury was hard. Absalom is even harder, and I just can't do it. But now that they've released the HSC prescriptions, my priority for reading now is just to actually finish reading those, and next year hopefully get a video out reviewing all of those. So next year, hopefully some changes to the channel. I want to introduce a few new things based on my own reading and writing practice. I don't know what my reading life is quite going to be like, but I think I am still doing book a day February, so maybe business as usual. I don't really know. This is just stuff that I do for fun. Thank you for joining. See you next year.